ערב טוב קהל נכבד, ברוכים הבאים לכנס סביב דמותו והגותו של אדוננו הרמב"ם. אנחנו לא כל כך רמב"מיסטים, אתם יודעים, רמב"ם וכלי נגינה ומוזיקה, זה בסדר. הרמב"ם משתמש במוזיקה לצורכי רפואה, יש לו איגרת ידועה ליורש העצר המצרי, שהוא מציע לו איך לישון, איך ינגנו לו, באיזה מיתר וכו'. אבל אנחנו, בכל אופן, מצרים מדברת אלינו. אז אנחנו נעשה מוזיקה מצרית. איתי נמצאים המוזיקאים, פרופסור תייסיר אליאס, והמוזיקאי אריאל כהן שינגן על הדף. והקטע הראשון שננגן הוא חתוות חביבי, פעמי האהוב, שהלחין המוזיקאי הגדול בעולם הערבי של המאה ה-20, מוחמד עבד אל-והאב. תודה רבה.
Thank you to Professor Taiseer Elias, Rav David Menachem, and Ariela Cohen on percussion for opening our evening in such a beautiful way. Good evening. My name is Raquel Ukeles, and I am curator of the Islam and Middle East collection at the National Library of Israel. Welcome to the closing session of our conference, There Was None Like Moses. Lo kam kemoshe, lem yakum ahad kemusa. Throughout this conference, we have primarily discussed Maimonides as a unique individual. There is no one like Moses, right? This evening, we have an opportunity to pull back and to look at Maimonides within the world that he lived and wrote as a philosopher in the medieval Islamic world. This evening, we have the pleasure of listening to a conversation between Professor Sari Nusseibeh and Professor Sarah Stroumsa, two great scholars and thinkers in their own right, and two old friends who have been discussing Islamic philosophy, among other topics, for, I believe, 50 years. Yes? More? It is my honor to introduce them, and then I'll invite them to join me on stage. Sarah Stroumsa is the Alice and Jack Ormat Professor Emerita of Arabic Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She taught in the Department of Arabic Language and Literature and the Department of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where she served as rector of the university from 2008 until 2012. Among her many publications, I'll mention some of the recent ones. Maimonides in His World, Portrait of a Mediterranean Thinker from Princeton University Press of 2010. Dawood al-Muqammas, 20 Chapters, which was a reprinting of her, or an expansion of her doctorate, from Brigham Young University Press in 2016, and the forthcoming Princeton University Press book, Andalus and Sfarad, on philosophy and its history in Islamic Spain. Professor Sari Nusseibeh is the former president of Al-Quds University and continues to teach a graduate seminar in Islamic philosophy at Al-Quds University until today. Among his many publications, I will mention a few recent ones. In 2018, Routledge published his book, Avicenna's Oriental Philosophy, which culminates work begun as his PhD thesis at Harvard, which was completed in 1978, and His Story of Reason in Islam, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2016. Please join me in welcoming our featured guests to the stage. No, you say, I think you say, okay?
Should I go there?
So everybody gets a microphone.
Okay.
So in order for us to begin our conversation about Maimonides as a philosopher in the medieval Islamic world, it would be helpful if we could get a few other characters into our discussion. So I want to start by asking each of you to share with us who is your favorite Islamic philosopher, not counting Maimonides for a moment.
Well, it's a hard question.
I think it's on. Should be on.
Okay. It's a hard question, first of all, because I assume that when you say favorite Islamic philosopher, you mean the philosopher whose works I like to read. Sometimes I try to think whether I would have liked to meet these people, and I tend to doubt it with most of them. For one thing, some of them are known to have had a cantankerous character, and Also, one should mention that I suppose none of them would speak to me because I'm a woman.
Right.
But still, if I think of people that I really enjoy reading, one comes from the area which is today Iran, and this is Abu Bakr al-Razi from the 10th century. And the reason I like reading his works is the tone that comes through from his works of trying to be very honest intellectually, so always critical of other people's thought as well as of his own without being haughty. The fact that he was considered to be a heretic or a free thinker also makes him an interesting figure to read. And the other person I'd like to mention is Ibn Bajjah from the other end of the Islamic world, who died in 1138. And again, it's the voice that comes through from his works. It's very measured. He is not trying to impress people. He's calculating his words. And you get a feeling of listening to someone who really thinks as he writes.
Sari? I think it's on.
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to say that one interesting thing probably about Ibn Bajjah that Sarah just mentioned is his interest in music. And connecting with Maimonides, one of the things Maimonides liked about Ibn Bajjah was his interest in music. Maybe that's the real reason why you like him. But I like Razi, actually, the other person you mentioned, for some of the stuff that he said in his ethical works. And in particular, that which has to do with defining how a good person should act. It's not a very long passage, but it's a few lines that sort of somehow got themselves inscribed into my head. Now, to go back to the person that I like, you asked, like. Well, I'm very sort of a loyal person, so I maintained my admiration for the philosopher I worked on in my early days, Avicenna, and I still love reading him. And I love reading him because of the power of the intellect that he reflects in his writings. It makes you think and think again and think again and again. And you never tire, in fact, of reading him. And, you know, I'm not sure about his life. I didn't go too much into that. But like all philosophers, I suppose, who lived in that period, they all had problems. Ibn Bajjah had problems. He had problems of spending time in jail in different places. Avicenna, too. Or being incarcerated or something like that. So I'm not sure about their characters, and maybe I wouldn't want to meet them either. But certainly meeting them intellectually, all of them, these people, is a very special experience. And I'm very lucky, I think, to have somehow chanced upon reading these people and staying close to them. But certainly, Avicenna is the person I like most.
So what we've heard so far from both of you is your interest in these philosophers for their intellects, for the way they think, their honesty. These are universal values. I would love to hear from each of you about what is distinctive of philosophy in the medieval Islamic world. What defines philosophers in this time and place?
Sarah, you're just written a book about this. Maybe you should tell us.
I think there are two questions here. What is this time and place? And then how do the philosophers fit into it? And I think that first of all, in order to imagine the time and place, what is nowadays called the medieval Islamicate world, we have to think of the extension of territory at some periods from the Indian Ocean to the Iberian Peninsula. And this is an area which is mostly dominated by various sorts of Islam, and it has one language. And one cannot overemphasize or cannot emphasize enough the importance of language. It's the closest we get to when we think about it is English today, and it's not at all similar because the whole area spoke and thought in Arabic. People had other languages which they cherished, the language of the Holy Writs. It could have been Hebrew, it could have been Syriac, but the immediate language, also for matters of their own religion, was Arabic. And they wrote in Arabic and read in Arabic, and as a result, among intellectuals, the immediacy of the ability to connect intellectually is unparalleled. The immediacy of associations, the same terminology bring the same associations. They have the same library. They read the same books translated from Greek or from Syriac or written by other people. So once they get together to the point where they know that you and I are both interested in philosophy, and I should say they also have the same education in some of the cases, the same curriculum of studies. Once they get together or they write to each other, they're on the same level. So in that, I think this is the frame within which we have to think. Then there is the question of what does it mean to be a philosopher within a society? In this case, it's a society speaking Arabic. But it's first of all to be a philosopher within any society. And I think that what is typical for the philosophers of this period is that while they are trying to be philosophers, they are trying to be also other things, leaders of their communities, courtiers, other things too. But
Taxi drivers.
merchants, yes.
Okay, I think if I can't remember the way you described it. You didn't actually use, I mean, you used a specific term, I remember, in that book that you mentioned about Maimonides, that he belonged together with the other philosophers, so-called philosophers, to the same public domain, so to speak. So in a sense, those people belong to their own different societies, but in another sense, they all belong to the same circle, being, as you said, educated in the same kind of way, talking the same language, talking to each other, addressing each other, and so on. And as you already said, I mean, you had people among them who were heretical, some who were Jewish, some who were Christian, and certainly some who were Muslim, and some who were Muslim by name only. I mean, so you had a kind of combination. But when I try to imagine, visualize what these people did, and by the way, we use the term philosopher here, but we must remember that we're really talking about people who were people of knowledge of all kinds. So there were the musicians, there were the engineers, the doctors, there were the mathematicians, the astronomers. So they were not only thinking or doing stuff that today one might call philosophy. They were basically looking at the world at large and trying to do different things in it. I mean, we already mentioned, for instance, people who were interested in, who did music, Avicenna, who did medicine, and others who did astronomy, and so, and others. And so philosophers were really, you know, people who basically searched for knowledge in whatever area they felt they could, in fact, achieve it. Now, how did they live? What were they like? I mean, I'm not sure, in fact. I think that they had difficult lives on the whole, a lot of them. I mean, you know, you can imagine that many of them did not necessarily make enough money from their writing, as many people actually today also suffer from the same kind of thing. But so often they had to rely on benefactors. And so very often we find a lot of the treatises, the letters, the books that are written addressed to some wazir or some guy that is their benefactor. And one wonders often, you know, how much they had to toe the line of the system or state or ruler they were working under. But there were certainly not many. I mean, you know, if you try to think of, I mean, we know them, and so we think there are many of them. But if you think of, you know, what was the number of intellectuals in that very wide Muslim world that you spoke about, or in the Islamic world? How many were they? And, you know, how did they interact with one another? How often did they see each other? I mean, today you do WhatsApp and you sort of interact immediately with, you know, or emails, and there you had to have, you know, people had to travel, and they traveled. It took a long time to go from one country to another, and meeting with people and so on. I think they had difficult lives. I wouldn't like to have lived the way they did. It's far more comfortable to live the way that one does now. And certainly if you were a philosopher, you had a problem, more of a problem than if you had been if you were a religious scholar of some kind or another. You know, if you were, then you were given special posts, you had the position in court, and the philosophers who at one stage or another took up such positions, like, for instance, Ibn Rushd or Averroes, you know, suffered. So did Ibn Pachi that you mentioned, so did Avicenna. So they did not lead simple lives. Sorry, go on. Sorry.
If I can continue from where you led us, and I think that there is a difference here between, or that we can make a difference between intellectuals, people interested in getting to know, curious people who want to know, who are avid to know, and who are also called Philosopher, and the group of people who define themselves and are defined by others as philosophers. And this is a smaller group, much smaller group. It does not include only people, everyone who had a smattering of logic or who had a smattering of mathematics, but really people who focused and who tried to lead all their life with an idea. I often think of how fitting the English expression to turn one's mind to. They really try to turn their mind to distilling the essence of truth. And some of them were Aristotelians, some of them were Neoplatonists, but this was really a very small group. So if you ask me, how did you call Maimonides within this group? You could call them the elite, they saw themselves definitely as an elite. But in some ways, they're a small minority. So if you think of the Jewish minority, the Christian minority, across these minority and across the Muslim majority, you can handpick several people, and there are really a handful who are the philosophical minority. And yes, I agree, their life wasn't easy.
I want to pick up on two themes that I heard in your last comments. The first is I want to come back to Sari about this distinction between philosophy and reason. You wrote a book on reason, the story of reason. Where would you draw that line? So Sari, you talked about this broader group of intellectuals, perhaps, and then a smaller group of elites, the ones who turn their minds to philosophy. How would you describe that distinction, and was it a sharp distinction, or was it a spectrum? Was there a sense of elitism between and among these people?
Well, let me start, and Sarah can pick up on what I'm saying, if she wants. But let me first say that, to go back to what I said earlier, that what I really meant by people being philosophers, also being people who are really scientists, is that they did not only do logic or metaphysics or whatever, they also were doing other things. So starting, say, from the very first known philosopher, Al-Kindi, and you go through the list of stuff that he wrote about, and you find it covers, almost every field of knowledge, including how to make colors, how to color something, or to, mix colors to do something. So the philosopher was not somebody like today you might find, is what I meant, but somebody who, in fact, tried to involve themselves in everything that was available to them in nature, with which they could work their minds. And some of it was practical, and some of it was not, was theoretical. Now, so that's one thing. The other thing is, to go back to the question of reason and philosophy. Well, as we know, to go back to basics again, I mean, if we start with Al-Kindi, whom I just mentioned, you will find that right from the beginning, there was a problem of, on the one hand, looking at or considering what was called the Greek tradition, which was basically the sciences, including philosophy in the small sense, but philosophy also in the large or wide sense, and between the religious sciences, or traditional or transmitted sciences. And the people like Al-Kindi were aware of this distinction. And the assumption was, one thing, one sort of stream was totally intellectual, totally based on reason, whereas the other was based upon religion, inspiration, the Quran, and so on. Now, this bifurcation eventually made for, I think, a not very, I don't think a very sort of clear distinction between the so-called rationalists or philosophers as such and the other guys, the guys who did hadith. Now I just met one of them, and the guys who did jurisprudence, for instance, and so on. Now, I think the people who did the stuff that is called religious sciences, including hadith, for instance, or jurisprudence, fiqh, were actually very rational. And if you look at what they were doing, including, of course, kalam, as you will also be able to agree with me, I hope. Basically, they were using their reason. The philosophers were using, the philosophers in the strict sense were also using the reason, but basically thinking that the reason that makes sense is the reasoning methodology of Aristotle, to do the sort of 1+1 logic kind of thing. Now, So to go back to the earlier discussion, what I was saying was that this kind of distinction wasn't, to my mind, a very clear one. If the lens we're using to look at the intellectual milieu is the lens of deciding, who are the thinkers, philosophers, if you like, and that if we use this lens, we'd find a much larger group of people, circle of people, who would, some of them be called philosophers like Avicenna or whoever, but others, who are religious philosophers or religious scholars. Now I was saying that even if we took all of them, I mean, how many were they at any one point in time? And this is my earlier point. My earlier point was that, if you think of them in terms of their wider community, they still were a minority, regardless of what religion or with no religion. They were a minority. So the question is always, how did these people fare? How did they behave? How did they try to live their lives in the larger Muslim world with its values, with its... we look upon them today as something very special, but, looking back, I think to myself, people didn't care about them at the time, just like people don't care about philosophers today.
Well, on that cheerful note, why don't we invite our trio of musicians back to the stage for another musical passage. And while they're coming up on the stage, I want to pose my next question to give you a few minutes to think about, and that is, so far what we've heard is that the philosophers seem to constitute a kind of minority in this Islamicate civilization, and that what they did share is a language of Arabic. But I want to push both of you a little bit more to talk about what part of this whole world was Islamic, and that is, where is Islam in the framework in which they are operating, as opposed to a contemporary philosopher or a modern European philosopher or Indian, Asian, etc. Okay, so now we'll enjoy.
אנחנו עוברים לרבנית של מצרים, לאום כולסום, לשיר המפורסם בבתי הכנסת, על הבלד אל-מחבוב. השיר הזה מתוך הסרט ווידד משנת 1936. לטובת אלה שלא יודעים ערבית, אז הפזמון החוזר אומר, קח אותי לעירו של האהוב, התרגשותי גאתה והריחוק צורב בי. والبعد كويني على بلد المحبوب وديني زاد وجدي في البعد كويني حبيبي أنا قلبي معاك طول الليل سهران وياك يا حبيبي أنا قلبي معاك طول الليل سهران وياك تتمنى عيني رؤياك وديني زاد وجدي والبعد كويني ودخاكي عني تاني ذاتهيلي لشوعا ودخاكي عني تاني ذاتهيلي لشوعا ابن مأسو هبونيم هايتالي روش بينا أنا أدوناي هوشي عنا أنا أدوناي هوشي عنا أنا أدوناي أتلي حنا أنا أدوناي أتلي حنا على بلد المحبوب وديني زاد وجدي والبعد كويني على بلد المحبوب وديني زاد وجدي والبعد كويني.
Thank you. I want to come back to a point, Sari, that you made that I really loved, and that was that the philosophers, which hopefully on one of these screens is a list of selected philosophers and thinkers of the medieval Islamic world, that these philosophers approached all aspects of life through the same lens of intellectual curiosity and the quest for reason and knowledge, right? And not just that they had a day job as a doctor and then they did philosophy on the side, right? And so what we've heard so far is a lot about this, the culture of philosophy and the way in which philosophers approach the world. And now I would like to again pull out a little bit and help us understand why this is happening specifically in the Islamic Empire. And is it a coincidence? Was it a kind of benign neglect? Or are there distinctly Islamic elements that enabled this culture, this minority, to develop, to flourish more or less, as we have heard so far? Help us understand.
So I'll start again with what Sari said, and with Ibn Bajjah, who, when he speaks about the things that unites philosophers, when in his farewell epistles, Risalat al-Wada', when he tries to explain what unites him and the addressee of the epistle, he doesn't use the word intellect, the word aql that we would expect for the rationalist drive, but he uses the word pleasure, the pleasure of learning. And he says, what unites me and you and everyone who belongs to our friends, or our brethren, is this pleasure in learning. Now, and he continues to say these would be our brethren of today, of past generations, of future generations. Basically, what Ibn Bajjah is telling us here is it's not specifically in the Islamic world. This is what a philosopher is everywhere. And the question would then be, what was it in the Islamic world which in certain parts, at certain periods, allowed the flourishing of philosophy, which is an interesting question. But rather, how did they manage, assuming that a philosopher everywhere would have this drive, the pleasure of learning and the drive to focus and to get higher and higher, then how do they manage in a religious world? In this case, an Islamic world. And you asked before how much was it an Islamic world for them? And I think now we have to be more specific and say, who is the them? Because some of them were Jews, and some of them were Christians, and some of them were Muslims, and they did not live the impact of Islam in the same way. I think that in some ways, for Muslim philosophers, it was the hardest because they had to deal with their own religion, which was also the dominating religion. For philosophers of the minority, there was, in some ways, of course, being a minority, a religious minority, you were sometimes persecuted. Sometimes you entered into polemical discussions, so in some ways it was harder. But in some ways it was also easier as a philosopher because you didn't have to give an account to this religion, to Islam, as to how does your philosophical idea accommodate your own religion. That was a different question. So in some ways they had a safe place, Christians and Jews. In some ways it was easier for them.
Yeah, I think I'll add a few maybe ideas here. And maybe I'll draw on what I was saying earlier about this duality, on the one hand the Greek sciences, on the other hand religion. And I want to say that basically, so what did you have? You had the sciences coming over from the Greeks, pretending to be to the people in the Muslim world the vehicle for achieving knowledge, and this was exciting. You know, you had to achieve knowledge; it's a good thing to do. Some of them wanted to do it in order to manipulate nature. Some of them wanted to do it in order to know more. Some of them for pleasure. Some of them for money. Whatever the reason. So on the one hand, you had this body of knowledge, and then on the other hand, you had religion. You had the Muslim religion, God, and so on. And I think what happened was, in that climate, that people who were thinking or trying to understand what was happening tried basically to link between those two fields, and therefore, in fact, what emerges is something holistic in the sense that on the one hand the religion is there, and on the other hand the science is there, but they're combined, they're sort of together. And because they are like this, you know, when you pick up anybody, any philosopher, whether it is Christian or Muslim or Jewish, you will find very often the discussion is the same. They're talking about the same things. Already they have left a little bit of Aristotle behind, but they've taken a little bit of him with them. And, you know, I mean, for instance, I mean, Sarah should tell us, but I mean, you look at somebody like, you know, the guide, Maimonides, and, you know, you find that he is basically telling us what all these guys around him are saying, and he participates in the discussion, he accepts some of the arguments, rejects some of the arguments. He accepts some of the arguments that Aristotle makes, rejects some of the arguments. And it's like that with all of them. So they're all living in the same crucible of having to deal with knowledge in the context of there being a God and there being religion. And they're all sort of trying to manage to pull things together in that context. And I think that's what unifies them, what makes them stand out as a group. And they're not religious philosophers, all of them. Some of them are. But they're all working within this milieu. And the religion they're talking about is not necessarily Islam. So for instance, if they're discussing, for instance, whether the world is eternal, okay, this is a Muslim problem, is the world eternal or was it created? But it's a problem Maimonides has to deal with from his perspective. And likewise with everything else, all the other issues that they dealt with were actually the same. And they were basically issues that, as I said earlier, that are derived from this sort of merger between, on the one hand, the so-called Greek sciences that are supposed to be non-religious, and religion, in this case Islam. But I don't think any of them really bothered too much, on the Muslim side at least, to defend specifically Muslim ideas, except, for instance, somebody like Al-Amiri, who is he there on the board? Okay. Because I think he was a strange guy. And I think he probably addressed philosophy in a totally new way by somehow Islamicizing it, properly Islamicizing it. And by saying that, I mean making everything you do as a Muslim something that philosophy requires. So it wasn't just principles. It was the specific duties that you're supposed to perform as a Muslim, or down to fasting and marriage and you name it. But otherwise, I think what I said.
I think that sometimes when I read some of these philosophers, it feels like observing a dance. If you look at certainly Maimonides in the guide, the way he deals with Jewish tradition, with verses of the Bible, uses exegesis and goes from the exegesis to Aristotle and back. Or if you look on some of the more theological tracts of Averroes, he uses the Hadith and the Quran and tries to harmonize it with the philosophical tradition. So each one of them, these two in particular, try to tap into his own tradition and connect it and harmonize it with his own philosophy, his own religion. But this is the usual dance, and sometimes you see them doing a step dance and going somewhere else and observing religion with a capital R from above, as if it's not my religion, your religion, just the phenomenon of religion, and how do you deal with it when you are a philosopher? And I think a striking example is Averroes, who says, well, a philosopher always chooses the last religion chronologically. So the Christians, when Christianity came, the philosophers, the Greek philosophers became Christians, and then Islam came and they became Muslims. And you would think that this is heretical enough, but then he goes on and to say, and the philosopher always has to believe that the last religion will be replaced by still a better one. And he writes it in Arabic for everyone to read. So this is a moment where he says, you know what? I play the Muslim, I am the Muslim Qadi, and I'm the Muslim, but there is a point of view high above which is different. And in that, he is not different than Yahya ibn Adi, the Christian, or Maimonides.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you finished, but I think that to just confirm what you're saying, I think, but to look at it differently also, on the one hand, there were sort of principles in the religions that people had to deal with. And the principles were like, did God create the world? Was it in time, before time? What sort of thing is he? And so on and so forth. Everything, all these questions that are questions that you will find, in all religions. And these are, let me call them principles, and these are matters that were dealt with equally by everyone, including Averroes. And then there was the need by the different philosophers every now and again to do the dance that you mentioned. So, for instance, Maimonides would go back to his religious books. Averroes would go back to his religious book. Yahya or whoever would go back to but on specific issues, basically to draw support for whatever it is that he's doing or saying. And definitely, yes, I think most of them, certainly Averroes, I'd say also Avicenna, but also most of them, but not Al-Amiri, would in fact play a double game. It's not a double game as far as the main principles are concerned, but it's a double game as the specific religion is concerned. And you already find, for instance, to go back again to Al-Farabi, for him religion was simply a political order. And political orders change, and it's a question of, what do you do? What is the best political order? And reading him, you sort of slowly come to realize, he speaks as if he speaks as a Muslim, but, I don't go to bed, so to speak, feeling comfortable with the thought that he really was properly a Muslim.
I want to bring together two threads in our conversation. And that is, earlier we talked about philosophy and reason. And we talked about a smaller elite circle and then a broader intellectual class. And now, in how we're talking about religion, it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the smaller group, the elite group, used religion as a kind of vocabulary for working out philosophical problems, and they were more or less committed to that vocabulary. But I want to broaden that circle a little bit and bring in those intellectuals. And you mentioned Al-Amiri. I was thinking of Ghazali or Saadia. And I would love to hear how religion functions. Is it more and less, or does something else happen among that broader circle in terms of how they think about religion? Maimonides seemed to think that he was different than that broader circle. But I would love to hear you think out loud about religion in these two cases.
Well, just a small comment, I think, since you mentioned Al-Ghazali, and to go back to something I think Sarah said when you said earlier in this conversation, I think, if not earlier, that the distinction very much depends on how people viewed themselves, whether they looked upon themselves as philosophers. So you have this person, Al-Ghazali, who is extremely philosophical, but who looked upon himself as something other than philosopher. And people don't look upon him. He was not, defined as a philosopher. He's supposed to have been anti-philosophical. And then you have, on the other hand, someone like this guy, Al-Amiri, who was listed as a philosopher. People assumed he was a philosopher. He did some philosophy. But I'm not sure he looked upon himself as a philosopher in the way that, for instance, Averroes looked upon himself as a philosopher. So what did he see himself as? What does it mean anyway to think of yourself as a philosopher? What is it that you think you are? When I earlier mentioned the wider circle, and I mentioned, for instance, jurisprudence, and to go, for instance, to somebody like Averroes, whom you mentioned, you go through the works of Averroes in jurisprudence. And of course, they're jurisprudence, so they're religious. But, you know, there's no way you cannot look upon those works as what today you might call philosophy of law. This is philosophy of law. But, you know, he wrote it as a jurisprudent, as a judge. So was he doing it as a philosopher? Was this regarded as a philosophy work? It wasn't, but actually it was. How did he regard it? I'm not sure. I think the lines are not very clear. And I think not only with jurisprudence, with everything else. I mean, we know Ghazali came and said, you know, there's these terrible people, the philosophers, and they're terrible for A, B, and C, and so on. But, you know, today, a lot of people would say about Ghazali, he was far more philosophical than the people he criticized for being philosophers. He was far more astute as a philosophical critic, some people would say.
Yeah, I think that the question of what does it mean actually to be, what does the word philosopher mean? I think this is crucial because in English we could say that they are all thinkers, they are all intellectuals, they all try to understand things and to learn things. I believe they all had the pleasure of learning, but especially, I think, after the 10th century, the word philosopher is used most specifically. Philosophe becomes the name of the school. So other thinkers are not defined as philosophers. The school tradition, those who take the classical tradition, they are philosophers and the others are not. Now, when a person like Maimonides or like Averroes or like Al-Farabi, for that matter, would look at the other thinkers and try to denigrate them and to say why they are not philosophers, they will not only say that they are not following the classical traditions, they will say something a lot harsher. They would say, they don't look for the truth. We look for the truth, they don't. And Maimonides has this very harsh statement that, I paraphrase it, he says the mutakallimun, the people, the theologians, they look at the facts and then try to mold the facts to suit their own beliefs. Whereas a true philosopher or a true scientist look at the facts and draws from them his philosophy. So I think somewhere the issue between them is the issue of truth, how committed you are to the truth. So Maimonides would say, yeah, they are not committed to the truth. Al-Farabi would say, no, they just, they are a sword, as it were, a sword to hire for their own religion. But if you read the Mutakallimun, not only Al-Ghazali and Al-Amiri, certainly, but even Mutakallimun like Abu al-Huzayl, they're certainly committed to the truth. This is what they are doing. This is what the whole thought is about. So we have different methods of approaching the truth, but I think the goal is the same for all of them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the two parties, each party claiming to be after the truth, each party claiming to draw its inspiration or whatever from some basic source of truth. On the one hand, Aristotle, on the other hand, the religious heritage. The religious heritage. But, you know, the but they're both basically depending on the heritage. You know, whether one party was depending on Plato or Aristotle or whoever, or the other party depending on the Quran or whatever, or Bible. I mean, they're just different schools fighting amongst each other. They're both committed to the truth. They both think that they know the truth. But that's a problem not only with them, it's with us. Still today, different people claim they know the truth and that their sources are better. Mine has God behind, for instance, or Aristotle. Anyway.
So I'm going
music
to
here.
ask to take a pause in our conversation and invite, I believe we're inviting Professor Taiseer Elias for the third musical passage. Or not.
מכיוון שהרמב"ם חי בתוך תרבות ערבית ויצר בה, אנחנו נבצע קטע שהוא שיר ערבי ידוע מאוד, אבל אני הכרתי אותו קודם כל בגרסה העברית שלו, ולא בגרסה הערבית המקורית. פרופסור אליאס ייתן לנו גם טקסים, אלתור נגינתי, אני קצת אתן אלתור קולי, מה שנקרא מוואל, ונשיר את השיר. استملى لما هكيت لي استملى أمان 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 عمي كمال لسانا أمان 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 حبي ماهر سلاحنا حبي ماهر سلاحنا أمان 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 حيتي كشيلك حبيرنا أمان 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 حبي من حيرتي ونبت بحيرتي بحوش علي عزرتي بأكرم لخولتي كي حسدخ علي قبر أمان 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 بأكرم لخولتي كي حسدخ علي قبر أمان 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 أمان
With our remaining time, I would like to focus in on the hero of our conference, and that is Maimonides. One of the purposes of our conversation is to enable us to understand Maimonides in a way that often people who study Maimonides don't speak about. In fact, I would say most students of Maimonides don't think about Maimonides in the way that we've been discussing. And so I want to start by going back to something that you said in the previous section, and that is that it comes down to how people self-identify. And so first I want to ask, how did Maimonides see himself in this world? Did he see himself as just a philosopher? Did he see himself as a philosopher, part of a minority community, meaning the Jewish minority community, or did he identify as a philosopher in the Islamic world? Let's start there.
I think that if he had one word, he would say a Jew. That was the first definition, definitely. That was the frame of his life, that formed his biography, that was the first thing for him. But then you ask whether as a Jewish philosopher, and he, unlike most Jewish thinkers, I think he identified also with a school tradition. He saw himself as belonging to the philosophical tradition that starts with Al-Farabi and then moves to Ibn Bajjah and maybe starts a little earlier with Aristotle. So he identified very clearly with the school tradition. But I think that if you asked him, are you a philosopher of the minority? I doubt that he would say that. I think that often he thought of himself as the lonely philosopher who has one person to talk to and nobody understands, but at the same time part of a bigger community, which is the best possible community. And somewhere there was the idea that we are advancing towards a position where most people will understand more of the truth. Most people will not be so harsh towards Jews. Most people will get closer to believing in the one God in the way that they should believe in, that is to say, uncorporeal and so on. So I think there were times where he was very discouraged, and we can see it in his letters where he writes to the students, to the recipient of the guide, and says, I have nobody. You have to watch out for other people. They are like wild beasts. This is a topos among the philosophers. Other people of your own community are like wild beasts. Watch out for them. And there are times where he speaks in a very optimistic way, that as a philosopher, he can guide his community to create a just world, to imitate God and direct humanity towards a just world. So there are fluctuations for as long as he lived, and I think one can see it also in other philosophers.
Do you think that Maimonides saw his worlds as a dual worlds, that he had a dual personality? As you started to say, he was part of this philosophical tradition and he was part of this community. Or did he envision his personality as one integrated personality?
He says at the beginning of the guide that nobody can hold on to the good moments of understanding, that you reach an understanding and then you fall. So even a person with a very focused person like he was has different stages. In that sense, nobody, as a human being attached to the body, you are not homogeneous. You have fluctuations. That's part of human condition. I think one can see how he sees himself also from the other end of the guide, from the parable of the palace, where he describes human beings as encircling the palace of the king, and some get closer and some are really close, and some walk in the wrong direction. And you can say that also about himself. There is this encircling movement of trying to get closer and then sometimes being misled or pushed back by the force of the body and the bodily needs, and then pulling back. So it's until death, it's not a stable condition, by definition.
Does being a philosopher in the medieval Islamic world mean that you are a searcher, as Sari was describing, or and that philosophy then informs every aspect of your life, or do these figures that you mentioned, did they play different roles? Do you see them as integrating what they were doing, or that they did philosophy for their elite group and then they did something else, whether it was intellectual or otherwise, for the masses?
It's a hard question. Let me answer it by first going back to what Sari was saying, trying to sort of understand the answer that she gave to your earlier question about Maimonides. And if I understood the question correctly, something of it had to do with this duality of being a philosopher and being, a man of God, if you like. But the other had to do with being an individual living as a minority in the Islamic world, as a Jew. Now, as far as the second part is concerned, there must have been, you know, as I think Sarah said at the very beginning, there was, she said it was easier for Jewish and Christian, but I think, yeah, I mean, I think, I can't imagine what it must have been like, but it must have been, I would say, scary to be living in a world in which you thought yourself to belong to some different, or the others to belong to another species that was sort of all surrounding you. With regard to the other point, which is the fluctuation, I think this sort of, you know, this is probably something that afflicts everyone, including perhaps philosophers, in more maybe astute ways, this kind of uncertainty, this inability to hold on to a specific thought that at one stage you thought was it, and that somehow vanishes in the next moment. I mean, it's a thing, I think, that afflicts, as I say, normal people, children, you know, they pick up an ice cream thinking this is it. No, I don't like it. But to go back to the second question that you asked me, what did they do? I mean, I think a lot of them, I mean, some of them had positions, and so they were happy doing their positions and doing the philosophy on the side. But a lot of them just didn't have anything else to do, but to do the philosophical work they were doing. And it must have been a difficult life because, you know, they knew they weren't really writing for the masses. I mean, they knew that only a few people would probably understand them. The image that Sarah spoke about earlier with Avampache, to do with becoming one with other minds, whether from the past or the present in different lands, was their consolation probably, because they probably had no friends, no real friends who could stand them. I don't know about their wives, for instance. We never hear about their wives. No, I think they must have led lonely lives. And but some of them were practical, you know, they were practitioners. As I say, some of them liked, I mean, you know, someone like, say, Ibn al-Haytham, who worked on optics, was really a scientist, first and foremost. But he was also a philosopher, a thinker. By the way, you asked us to bring some things to read out. I picked up something from him on ethics, which I'll do read the end if you like.
No, this was, I mean, this is our time.
Oh, this is your time.
Yeah.
This is our time.
This is our time.
Okay, so, okay, let me, I'll put it in my pocket. So it's a few lines. This is from his thing on ethics. Now, this is a guy who's more known for his being a person, you know, a forerunner in theories of optics. Don't ask me what that means because I'm not sure. But something to do with what seeing means. And he's written also an epistle on ethics. And I liked it. I'll read the translation. It's not a good translation, it's a very quick translation. So this is Ibn al-Haytham, who died in 1040, who was actually at one stage, it is said he feigned madness at one stage because the ruler in Cairo wanted him to, because he assumed, you know, he heard that he could do miraculous things, including a dam in the Nile, and then when he went there, he couldn't do it. So the ruler was very angry. And so he didn't know what to do. He sort of, anyway, so it says this thing is as follows. It behooves him who seeks perfection to habituate himself to loving all people, to befriending them, to acting kindly to them, to seek their pardon and to be merciful towards them. For people are all of a kind, being together in their humanity, and partaking of a divine power, one and all. This power is the rational soul. It is by virtue of this soul that a human being is human. A human being, in reality, is the rational soul. It is a single substance in all people. And people are all, in reality, just one thing. And they are different from each other only as individuals. But if their souls are all one, and if love is an affection of the soul, then it behooves them all to love one another and to be affectionate to one another. But if they allow the irascible part of the soul to dominate them, then they will soon become habituated to self-pride and to hate, to lord it over the weak and to belittle the poor, to envy the rich and the benefactor, all being the grounds where enmity is bred and where hatred prevails. This is on the love of humanity.
I didn't bring any text to read, but I'll follow Ibn al-Haytham with a story. You said, I don't think they had any friends. And they had, but very few. Usually Maimonides defines levels of friendship, and wives are the second level, not the highest level. The highest level is the philosophical friends. And there is a story that Ibn al-Kifti tells. Ibn al-Kifti was a very a theologian, a man of religion, 13th century, and when he lived in Aleppo, he befriended the recipient of the guide, Joseph ibn Shimon, and they became very close friends. And in one part of the biography of the physicians, which Ibn al-Kifti writes, he quotes a letter that he received from Baghdad from Ibn Shimon. And Ibn Shimon tells him that there was a trial of some intellectual, and he was subject to inquisition, a mihna, a hisba, and all his books were confiscated, and they were burned in the public space. There was a big auto da fe of all the books of this intellectual. And Joseph ibn Shimon writes to Ibn al-Kifti and describes how the men of religion who burned the books took them one by one and described them and threw them into the fire. And one of the books that he described is a book by Ibn al-Haytham, which describes the universe and the planets. And the person said, this is heresy, and threw it into the fire. And Ibn Shimon writes to Ibn al-Kifti and says, this is not heresy, this is the truth. This is how God runs the world. This is how we can understand his wisdom, etc. And it's very clear that for Ibn al-Kifti and for Ibn Shimon, they think in the same way. They are friends in philosophy.
We just have a few more minutes, and I would like to ask each of you to summarize for us what we've learned about Maimonides through this conversation. What does the lens of philosophy in this time and place in the medieval Islamic world help us understand about Maimonides that we wouldn't necessarily see?
Wow. Can you make it simpler?
I think that it's, we started with the philosophers we loved, and you said, don't mention Maimonides, so I didn't. But I really, he is a favorite philosopher, of not only of others, but also of me, because there is something so coherent and deep in the way he combines all the different topics of his thought. And I think what from this conversation we can take is that the different parts of his thoughts are very wide. It's easy to see him concentrating on a verse and turning it in his mind. It's easy to see how he concentrates on halachic rule and goes deeper and deeper into it. And it's easy to see him concentrating on the question of the creation of the world. But what's amazing about Maimonides is that at the same time he combines the readings from his readings of Ibn Bajjah, of Averroes, of Al-Ghazali, of whoever, all the people he doesn't quote, let alone the people that he quotes, and he combines them. They are all present in his mind all the time. And if we want to give him the respect that is due to him, we cannot allow ourselves to say, no, this is less important, because for him it was all there all the time, I think.
Well, I can't say very much to add to what Sarah was saying. Maybe one particular word that she used in the beginning, which is clarity, is something that I find, for instance, and I only looked at the guide, and only at parts of it. So the parts where he talks about philosophy, and the parts where he talks about kalam or theology, and other parts. But, you know, what I found there was, in general, a very clear and astute mind, very independent, will, you know, put forward the basic ideas that he wants to discuss, that he wants to explain. And then he, you know, in a very, I think, analytical, very astute way, either defends or criticizes, including Aristotle. So he's totally independent. But, you know, I think, as you said, Sarah, I mean, I think primarily I felt him as someone who defines himself as being Jewish, therefore as also believing in, not necessarily as everybody else who's Jewish believes in their religion, but believing in his religion the way that he sees it. And that he looks through this lens at what we, you know, normal human beings, have been able to come up with through our own intellectual searches and attempts in trying to define truth. So I think there's a back commitment there, an astute lens, and certainly, you know, I could use him teaching my students what the Kalam theologians, Muslims, had to say and why they were wrong, just, you know, as well as Ghazali. So,
I was very struck when you read the passage from Ibn Haytham that many of the themes in that passage sound like they're coming straight out of Maimonides' code, his Mishneh Torah, in the section on deot, developed opinions, or ethics, right. And to me, this conversation clarifies so clearly the world of the values and ideas from which Maimonides came from and that he swam in. It's not that these values can't be found in Jewish tradition, but they are so clearly coming from all these different characters that, thanks to you opened up for us. That Maimonides, yes, is a distinctive, unique individual. There was no one like Maimonides, but at the same time, he was part of this this world, perhaps a lonely world, but with a few friends. And I want to thank you both for sharing this world with us and opening it up. Thank you, Sari, and thank you, Sarah. And we are going to invite our wonderful musicians back to the stage. Before I introduce them one more time, I want to point out that with the end of the session, our conference comes now to a close. The conference does end, but the program is not over. Tonight begins a season of public events related to what we have called Beit Midrash HaRambam, Medraset Ibn Maimun, that we will build next to the exhibition, which is called Maimonides, From the Invention of Printing to the Digital Age, on the library's ground floor downstairs. This Medraseh, this Beit Midrash, will host lectures, workshops, classes, and open study, all that will address Maimonidean thought in all of its vast dimensions. The program of events will be published on the library's website, and you are all most invited to join us and to participate. It's my pleasant duty to thank all those who worked to organize this conference. Many colleagues participated in this work, and their names are hopefully listed on the screens before you. But we cannot conclude without expressing our profound gratitude, in particular to Professor Moshe Halbertal, who worked side by side with us in preparing the conference, investing deep and meaningful content in the conference program with great commitment and with great generosity. Of course, we want to thank our esteemed colleague, the National Library's Academic Director, Professor Elchanan Reiner, for building the program as well, and the phenomenal team of National Library staff. Thank you as well to our partners and friends at the Israel Museum, whose collaborative work enabled us to bring to fruition the important project of this conference. There was none like Moses. And we are going to take our leave from the stage so that we can turn our full attention to our maestros, our phenomenal musicians, Rav David Menachem, Professor Taiseer Elias, and Ariel Cohen. Thank you and good night.
אנחנו נסיים את הערב בשיר המצרי שחרך אולי את המזרח התיכון של כולסום שהלחין מוחמד עבד אל-והאב, אתה חיי, אינתה עומרי. رجعوني عليك لأيام اللي راحوا علمونا ندم على الماضي وجراحه عمري ضايع يحسبوا ازاي عليا اللي شفته قبل ما تشوفك عينيا عمري ضايع يحسبوه ازاي عليا اللي شفته قبل ما تشوفك عينيا عمري ضايع يحسبوه ازاي عليا انت عمري اللي ابتدى بنورك صباح اللي ابتدى بنورك صباح وانت عمري عينك تسرح في دنيتهم عينيا ايدك ترتاح للمستهم ايديا عينك تسرح في دنيتهم عينيا ايدك ترتاح للمستهم ايديا يا حبيبي تعالى يا حبيبي تعالى وخفايا يا حبيبي تعالى يا حبيبي تعالى وخفايا اللي فاتنا فاتنا يا حبيبي روح شوية يا أغلى من أيامي يا أحلى من أحلامي يا أغلى من أيامي يا أحلى من أحلامي خدني لحنانك خدني عن الوجود وابعدني خدني لحنانك خدني عن الوجود وابعدني بعيد بعيد انا وانت بعيد بعيد وحدينا رحوك اني بقد رحوك لبدنه عالحب نسخ ايامنا عالشوق تنام ليالي سمحت بك الزمن نسيتني بكلامي ونسيت معاك الشجن صالحت بك أيامي سمحت بك الزمن نسيتني بكلامي ونسيت معاك الشجن يحزنوني عيني ليمشي خلفه لمدوني لمحول علي عبر وفتعب اللي شفته قبل ما تشوفك عيني عمري ضايع احسبه ازاي عليا اللي شفته قبل ما تشوفك عيني عمري ضايع احسبه ازاي عليا اللي شفته قبل ما تشوفك عيني عمري ضايع احسبه ازاي عليا انت عمري انت عمري اللي ابتدى بنورك صباحه اللي ابتدى بنورك صباحه انت ولك انت عمري. תודה רבה לפרופסור תייסיר אליאס, לאריאל כהן, ערב טוב.